Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna was born on February 21st, 1794, in Jalapa, Mexico, to a well-off family. His father was Don Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, a lawyer and a chief notary of Alcolia in Veracruz. His mother was Doña Manuela Maria Severino. From a young age, he wanted to join the army because there was the local garrison that all the boys were into watching. He joined as a cadet against his father's wishes on June 9, 1810, when he was only 16. From an early age, he was quarrelsome and courageous. He was with the Veracruz regulars and sent to help with the independence movement, fighting on the side of Spain. In 1816, he was sent back to Veracruz as adjutant to the Viceroy of Veracruz and an instructor. During this time, he had a lot of downtime and read many of the classics. In 1821, he pursued the rebel garrisons with 200 men and surprised an advance group of rebels. He proclaimed he had won a victory and was basking in it when 2,000 rebels under Jose Joaquin de Herrera arrived at the plaza. He parleyed with them and negotiated himself command of Veracruz and to be made a colonel if he joined the rebels. Herrera also explained to him. He told him about the Plan de Iguala, and Santa Anna joined the rebel cause against Spain. He then went on to capture Jalapa and Santa Cruz. He set up a meeting between the leader of the city and rebel leader General Iturbide. They were able to win, and Iturbide became Emperor of Mexico. However, his late turn made it so that the regency didn't fully trust Santa Anna at the time, and it took him a while to be promoted to brigadier general. Later on, suspicion was aroused in Iturbide against Santa Anna by General Echavarri, and he went to Veracruz, where Santa Anna had been placed in charge, and asked him to go to Mexico City instead. Santa Anna snuck away and completely changed his tune about the emperor, who he had been supporting up until now. He called out Iturbide's dissolving of Congress and began listening to Miguel Santamaria and his political theorists. With the help of veteran insurgent Guadalupe Victoria, he led troops to Alvarado and Cordoba, but the imperial commandant routed him all the way back to Victoria's army, so he was ready to flee the country. Victoria told him to get back to the fight, and Santa Anna listened. General Jose Antonio Echavarri then joined him, even though he had started the suspicion of Iturbide against Santa Anna in the first place. Emperor Iturbide was overthrown and exiled. Mexico became a republic. Over the next few years, Santa Anna got into his fair share of trouble with power grabs. So he was sent back to Veracruz, where he stayed on his estate, Manga de Clavo. He married his wife, who was only 15 at the time, Doña Maria Inés de la Paz. And for about 2.5 years, he stayed out of trouble. During the civil war between political factions, he was on his way to support one party when he encountered Vicente Guerra, the leader of the other party. So instead, he joined Guerrero and helped him instead so that he could become governor of Veracruz. After they had won, in support of Guerrero later on, he was declared an outlaw after Guerrero lost the election and was chased to a fort which he held for 36 days. Then he escaped to Oaxaca, where he was held in a siege. After he and some troops were caught in a desperate attempt to escape, he negotiated, saying he had information about a Spanish invasion, which later turned out to be true. The president eventually resigned, and Guerrero became president. Santa Anna was renamed governor, and now military commander of Veracruz. The Spanish tried to invade Mexico in July of 1829. However, Santa Anna and Guerrero were ready, and Santa Anna took his troops to surround the Spanish. The Spanish were at the mouth of the Panico River, not far from Tampico. They had been weakened already by storms, and sickness hit them soon after. Santa Anna surrounded them, and a hurricane worsened their situation. They probably were already defeated, but Santa Anna really wanted the win, so he attacked them. His casualties were extremely high, and he would have lost if not for last-minute reinforcements. The defeat of the Spaniards turned him into a mythical hero despite his near-catastrophic loss. So in the eyes of the people, he became a legend. When Guerrero's enemies tried to oust him, Santa Anna joined Guerrero's cause, showing his loyalty. But Guerrero soon resigned his lost cause, and Santa Anna was deserted by most of his troops. Guerrero was later shot for revolting. Santa Anna started a revolt on January 2nd, 1832. He withstood a siege in Veracruz, but he declared that all of his points must be met whenever they came to meet with him. So instead they attacked him. After holding out a long time, he joined the actual winner of the presidency of 1828, Gómez Pedraza. Though he had hated Pedraza, Santa Anna saw certain advantages for himself if he joined him, and together they defeated the government. After that, he headed home to Manga de Clavo, but 3 months later, when Pedraza's term was up, he was named chief executive and became the president of Mexico. He was a good candidate because he hadn't yet become very involved with politics, so his reputation wasn't tarnished, and he was still looked at as the hero of Tampico. He liked the glory but not the responsibilities, and generally used force in changing around things that he didn't like. After a while, he gave up the presidency to his vice president, Gómez Farias, by pleading poor health. Gómez Farias was a liberal and didn't get along with the church. So the liberal government eventually secularized education, but there was nothing to replace it, so conservatives and Catholics alike called for Santa Anna to come out of retirement. He did, and he made a speech that he would uphold the civil liberties and repealed some of the laws against the church. However, there was a revolt, and General Escalada tried to overthrow the government. It's unknown whether Santa Anna was helping Escalada overthrow Farias, and it's still debated to this day. But the revolt was put down, and Santa Anna went back to the presidency and exiled the conservative leaders in an effort to gain favor with the liberals. General Escalada then exposed his plan, naming Santa Anna as part of it. He tried to revolt, but was defeated, and Santa Anna went back to Manga de Clavo, his home, yet again, giving up the presidency. On April 24th, 1834, he came back to the presidency at the outcry of the people. He dissolved Congress, suspended anti-religious laws, and exiled Farias. A new Congress was elected in December 1834 and assembled, January 4th. General Miguel Barragan was appointed president ad interim, and Santa Anna again went home. The government still had power over the church in this case, but it was no longer repressive. During the Texas Revolution of 1836, Santa Anna marched north with an army. Texas was trying to secede, and to stop it, he ended up the villain of the Alamo, slaughtering every man and only leaving a few women and slaves alive. He had demanded immediate surrender, but the people in the Alamo had refused. So he assaulted it and lost 400 soldiers in that battle. Samuel Houston, who commanded 800 men and 2 cannons, was waiting to fight him. Santa Anna had 700 men and 1 unreliable cannon. Samuel Houston's 2 cannons were called the Twin Sisters. So Santa Anna mounted an attempt to capture those 2 cannons. So Santa Anna set about waiting for reinforcements. However, he allowed his men to relax and was attacked by surprise and massacred on April 21st, 1836, at the Battle of San Jacinto, which is pictured. After the battle, he wandered in a daze for several days until he was captured, during which time he signed treaties of Texan independence. At home, this tarnished his image, since he didn't have the authority to do so anymore. He also ordered his soldiers to retreat. He was passed around between several different groups, and his life became in danger. He sent a letter to President Andrew Jackson asking for respite, which he didn't grant him. He wore a ball and chain for months, and his ankle was by the end of it worn to the bone. On November 35th, 1836, he was finally allowed to go to Washington. The North of the U.S. liked him because they didn't want the slave states to get power, and they wanted his claim on Texas to succeed. After talking to Andrew Jackson, he managed to secure his freedom and also put off recognizing Texas as an independent country by claiming that he did not have the authority and that Mexican Congress had to approve that. He was sent back to Mexico and went home to Manga de Clava with a tarnished political image and an uncertain political climate. In 1838, the French tried to invade Mexico in the Pastry War. Santa Anna heard cannon fire from his home and joined a fight at Veracruz, where he recommended abandoning the fort and starting negotiations. They started to do that, and then they received an order from the president to declare war and for Santa Anna to take command. Santa Anna gladly followed these instructions. An old adversary of his didn't bring troops to him, though, and the French managed to land in Veracruz. He ran from quarter to quarter in the streets and managed to block the streets and mobilize the soldiers. But then he got ambitious and tried to cut off the retreat of the French, exposing him and his men to fire. His leg and a finger were blown off by a cannon. He and his soldiers retreated, and laying on his apparent deathbed, he wrote a dramatic speech and report about his victory and his death. And he was won a lot of recognition. His past political sins in the Texas Revolution were forgiven by the country for his service, largely due to this letter which proclaimed his patriotism. He beat them, then went back to Manga de Clava again. Then he became one of 3 generals to lay siege to Mexico City against the newest president. Then Santa Anna was elected again and established temporary military dictatorship. He took money from the church to buy lavish things for himself, venerated his leg as a symbol of patriotism, levied heavy taxes, and buried his leg in a special place where it could be looked at by everyone. He then left for Manga de Clavo again and left Nicolas Bravo in charge. He gave up the dictatorship for the Constitution of 1843, but he issued orders restricting civil liberties, causing Bravo to resign. His first wife died, and he married 15-year-old Doña Dolores de Tosta. When Santa Anna went to crush a rebellion in October 1844, he left in charge President Canalizo, who dissolved Congress in order to prevent them from trying to overturn Santa Anna's rule. The uproar over that was tremendous, and crowds pulled down the statue of Santa Anna and took off with his much loved leg. Santa Anna turned his army around, but many of them deserted, and he wandered for days in the hills again before he was arrested and put on trial. He was exiled to Cuba, but his many heroic deeds were related, preventing his execution. So on June 3rd, 1845, he left for Cuba. Shortly after he left, the Mexican-American War began over the border between Texas and Mexico. Santa Anna was called back to lead the military in the Mexican-American War in August 1846. To get through the American blockade, he implied to the Americans that he would work toward a settlement between the two countries. However, this never came back up. Initially, whenever he arrived in Mexico, he refused the presidency and set about raising an army and funds. Meanwhile, the factions in Mexico City ended up designating him president anyway, with Gomez Farias as vice president. Farias took command in Mexico City. Santa Anna got 15,000 men at San Luis de Potosi with his own funds, and started marching across the desert on January 28, 1847, to meet Zachary Taylor's troops. He lost 4,000 men on the march across the desert. Taylor and Santa Anna fought at La Angostura, but Santa Anna realized the odds were too great and retreated on the second day. He told Taylor that to parley would make him a traitor. So he prepared for battle in the eyes of Taylor, but was actually preparing for retreat. He ended up retreating, and while the factions in Mexico City both wanted him, he picked the moderates to back. He was sworn in as president and tried to defend the coast, but the troops were so demoralized by all the infighting at that point, they were unable to defend the coast, and most people just wanted peace in the government. He returned to the capital to take the presidency for the 10th time, fortified Mexico City, but he still lost the battles, and the Americans eventually made it into the city. He called an armistice, but didn't want to give up any territory for peace, because the country wanted to resist still, so he kept his integrity that way. The Americans then took the military school at Chapultepec, which is pictured. Santa Anna was forced to flee to Tehuacan, but then more attackers from Texas came after him. He signed a peace treaty, and then the Americans allowed him to leave Mexico on April 9, 1848 for Jamaica, and then he moved to Colombia. At that point, he spent several years raising cattle and farming tobacco and sugarcane. A few years later, he was called back to take over from a weak liberal regime. On April 20th, 1853, he became president for the last time. He sided with the conservatives and eventually became a pretty powerful dictator, and designated that people should call him the Most Serene Highness, though he had rejected previous claims of the military to take more responsibility and more titles. It's interesting that he started out opposing the Emperor Iturbide at the beginning of his career, and by the end had become a dictator himself. Early on in his dictatorship, several of his advisors died, and he lost all political direction. The Gadsden purchase of Mexican land by the United States for $10 million caused unrest and discontent. He went to fight the rebels, but Santa Anna couldn't find them because they didn't yet have the arms and the men. He went back to Mexico City and had a plebiscite to vote whether he should stay as the leader of the country. it backed him on December 1st, 1854. In 1855, the rebels got enough of their arms, men, and money together to fight Santa Anna. However, Santa Anna couldn't find them with his men. The unrest and revolt spread throughout the country, so that he was facing odds on all sides. He left for Veracruz on August 9th, 1855. First, he stayed in Havana, then moved back to Turbaco, and eventually to St. Thomas Island. At this point, he believed Mexico needed a monarchy. So in 1862, he landed with a proclamation which got him arrested and expelled. At this point, he changed his mind back to thinking Mexico needed a republic, so he went to the U.S. and his property was confiscated while he was gone. In 1867, he returned with plans for a republic, but was imprisoned for 2 months, expelled again by Juarez, and not allowed to return until after Juarez died in 1874. In his last years, he was dependent on his son-in-law's money and didn't have much going for him. He died on June 20th, 1876, and was buried in Guadalupe. Overall, he was a symbol of stability in unrestful times. He was militarily daring, charismatic, but wouldn't necessarily commit to the people. He was a very vain person, often asking for his Overall, he was a very vain person. He was very dramatic in his letters, and early on in his career tried to give himself promotions. He often said whatever he needed to get power politically. And his patriotism, though admirable, was very self-serving. He did show the occasional loyalty to Guerrero, but he was also very changeable and self-serving. He changed his mind many times between federalism and centralism, and he often focused on the superficial things, as seen with his lavish spending later on during his dictatorship. He was almost always initially supported by the military when he became president each time, because he rewarded them for their loyalty. In his own memoirs, he depicted himself as a true patriot. To this day, he's not very recognized in Mexico, and he's seen as kind of a traitor, although he's not necessarily deserving of that, because his only betrayal of Mexico was during the Texas Revolution. He seemed to generally want what was best for Mexico, though he often served his own needs with it. There are no statues of him today, and often the most publicized parts of his life are the most infamous parts of his life.